Design Principles and Practices Conference, proudly hosted by LaSalle, UAS. My name is Yasir Suratman, and I will be your host and moderator for this session. My guest for this inaugural forum is Jeanette Kwek, the head of the Center for Strategic Futures. A little bit about Jeanette. Jeanette joined the civil service in 2005, starting her career at the Ministry of Defence, where she worked on Singapore's defence relations with international partners. In 2009, she became one of the founding members of CSF, Center for Strategic Futures. Since then, she has worked in roles connecting Foresight with geostrategic issues. In her current role, she oversees the Center's research agenda and its extensive international network efforts, and works in growing Foresight capabilities across the Singapore public services. Just like me, she is married with 2 young children, except mine has facial hair and and is publicly embarrassed by me lah. And just like her, we are coffee addicts, right, Jeanette? Alright, got it. Alright. So Jeanette is here today to share with us the topic of strategic foresight and scenario planning, intersections with design. Without further ado, Jeanette Kwek, everyone.
Thanks very much. My children are also publicly embarrassed to see me, so we have that in common as well. Yeah. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks to LaSalle for the invitation. I have to say, when I first received the invitation, I was a little bit confused is not the right word, but I was wondering, actually, what value does the story of strategic foresight have for a conference on design principles? So hopefully, in the process of going through the presentation that we have today, we will collectively come to an answer. I think intuitively, right, design practitioners and futurist foresight practitioners have a sense that our practices do intersect. But we aren't always very good at articulating what that intersection is. Why do we feel that way? So hopefully, at the end of this presentation, we'll be a little bit clearer. So, why does the practice of foresight exist? Why should we care about the future? It hasn't happened yet. We have lots of present-day problems to keep us up at night. So why should we worry? Not just because our former Prime Minister said so, although he says so beautifully that it's on all my slides. But really because for Singapore in particular, thinking about our context, our operating environment is a critical capability. We are so dependent on what happens outside our shores that we must pay attention to what is changing in our operating environment and what is changing in our domestic environment so that we can be responsive to needs, right? Citizen needs, resident needs. But beyond that, foresight helps us to deal with 4 big challenges that are coming at us that are on the slide. The first is accelerating change. I think this one, I don't need to say too much. People already feel this sense that everything is changing faster and faster and faster. And it's very difficult to get a handle on what is real and what is true and what is causing some of these events that we see. The second is that more of the problems that we face are wicked problems, in that they don't fit neatly into any single domain. We no longer have problems that we can hand over to one ministry and close our eyes and let the ministry deal with it, because these problems cross boundaries, they cross disciplines, and they are causes and effects within these problems are interconnected. So my actions to solve my part of the problem may cause problems for you as you try to deal with your part of the problem. So we really need some way of approaching these wicked problems holistically. See the whole picture, see all the stakeholders, see how they're connected and how we have to move together. The third challenge is shocks and discontinuities. We have a sense that there are more and more crises that we can't anticipate coming at us in the future, from the future, and we want something that helps us anticipate some of these. And the last, which is actually secretly my favorite, which is why I put it last, is this notion that the future is hidden from us, but the past is something that we've all experienced. And so it has a very powerful hold on our imaginations. It has a very powerful hold on what we think of as possible. And if we don't have a way to break the hold the past has on our brains, then we will never be able to anticipate any of these things coming at us, because we expect tomorrow to look like yesterday, even though empirically it's not true, right? If you just look back 10 years, would you have imagined today would have looked like that 10 years ago? No. But because we've experienced yesterday but not yet tomorrow, it's very hard for us to think about tomorrow differently. So, how does Foresight help with all of these? First, Foresight as a practice is very good at helping us to break silos, because it encourages us to look at things holistically. It helps us to deal with these big challenges holistically. It encourages organizations to look outside of their stovepipes, look outside of their silos, for information to flow across barriers that maybe shouldn't exist. It's very natural for us to chunk problems into organizational pieces, right? It makes it easier to break down the problem, it makes it easier to organize solutions, it makes it easier to deliver solutions on the ground. But sometimes that chunking is unhelpful. Foresight provides a way to bridge across organizations. Our senior advisor, Mr. Peter Ho, also likes to say, it takes a network to fight a network. As problems increase in complexity, so our solution space must also increase in complexity. And Foresight provides a platform for us to build more complex ways of looking at these complex problems. The second goes back to this hidden future, powerful past problem. We need a tool that helps us reframe our assumptions about what is happening. And this is where the future provides a safe space for us to think about things differently. A shared view of the future allows us to also build new shared assumptions about what that future is going to be, or what we want that future to be, and how we're going to get there. It helps us to align our actions today because we're working towards a shared vision of tomorrow. The last is about anticipation. As a good civil servant, you must talk about anticipating needs. Being forward-looking and trying to imagine a broader swath of the future helps us to anticipate needs that maybe we might not have seen so early, and allows us to build capabilities ahead of time, which allows organizations or societies or peoples to be more resilient, because you've got more capabilities kind of in your toolkit before you need them. This is the history lecture part, which is very difficult to do right after lunch, so I'll try and be interesting. Storytelling, right? Foresight has actually been practiced for a long time in the Singapore government. In part because, as our former PM said, we needed it, right? We recognized very early in our history that we needed some kind of tool that let us understand our operating environment better and try and anticipate some of the changes and capabilities that we might need to build in earlier, so that Singapore as a country could be more nimble and could take advantage of opportunities as they were emerging and act early to avoid kind of pitfalls that we could see coming. We started with a tool called scenario planning, which I will talk about a little bit more in the presentation. Scenario planning in part because Royal Dutch Shell had at that time, by the early 80s, had so successfully used this magical method called scenario planning to survive the oil shocks that we wanted to know how they'd done it, but also because Royal Dutch Shell had a very strong presence in Singapore. And so the Singapore government could just kind of be like, can we send some people to come and learn from you? So we did. We sent 2 patients 0 to go over to Shell, learn the methodology from them, come back and infect the rest of us. They were incubated at the Ministry of Defence because the Ministry of Defence naturally has very long timelines for planning timelines. It takes a long time to acquire or build a weapon system and bring it online. They're very expensive. So naturally you want to be assured that you're buying something that you will actually use in 10, 15, 20 years. So it was a very natural place for us to incubate this capability. They found it so useful that by the mid-90s, we institutionalized scenario planning as a whole of government planning tool. And we opened the very imaginatively named Scenario Planning Office in 1995. We're very good at naming things, in government. And the mandate of SPO was to really come up with these forward looks, right? 15, 20 years from now, what does Singapore look like? Some scenarios, some possible futures. to nudge our thinking as a system, as a government, about possibilities. Otherwise, we get too fixed in our thinking about yesterday, and it become less nimble about tomorrow. Time passed, we found scenario planning to be useful, but then we realized it's good at some things but not all things. We experienced a series of shocks, financial crisis, 9/11, SARS, and we realized that scenario planning is good at helping us understand trends that have already mostly emerged, that you can see, and how they interact. But it's not great at understanding shocks and surprise, discontinuous change. So we started to cast about what other tools can we add to the toolkit. Horizon scanning, so looking for early warning signs of change, trying to understand the possibilities that these signals present to us. But also, and this is when the Centre was founded in 2009, how foresight and uncertainty and risk management and governance, all of these things, how do you fit them together? If you have the ability to understand your operating environment and see a little bit into the future, you can understand what risks are coming at you. Does it change how then you run your organization? How does it change how you run your organization? And that's what the Centre was set up to do in 2009. All of this, by the way, is with the benefit of 15 years of retrospective coherence. When we set up the Centre in 2009, none of us had any idea what we were doing. Our terms of reference were so vague that you could have driven a truck through them. And really it was just an experiment. 4 of us, plus one, the Centre head at the time, trying to figure out how all these pieces fit together and what we could do with it inside the government. At that time, we were also kind of a bit of an offshoot. We sat inside the Public Service Division in the Prime Minister's office, which for those of us who don't know is basically the HR department of the government, hardly the nerve center of decision making and policy making in government. That too has changed over time. In 2015, a new outfit called the Strategy Group in the Prime Minister's office, or Strat Group, was set up to do, this is a mouthful of words, medium-term policy planning and policy coordination, which is many words to say we were set up to try and figure out what is our level of ambition in the next bound of government. How can we get all the agencies on board with this view of what is the next bound? And what are the capabilities that we need to build to enable action? We were transplanted into this new organization to provide a longer-term frame for that medium-term perspective. But what it has also wound up doing for the Foresight enterprise in government is giving us a way to translate some of the output of the team into more things that are more useful and easier to act on for the public service. Very often they look at the kind of 15, 20-year time frame and go, this is very interesting. But what am I supposed to do with it now? It's a very interesting story about the future. How do I act on it? And us being part of Strat Group has actually helped with some of those, what we call the translation problems, between the very far off and the now. That, I've been talking for like 10 minutes about the story of the CSF, but we are really only one strand of foresight capability in government. What we've also spent the last 15 years doing is helping other parts of the system grow in-house capability to do this task, to do this job. My team is 10 people right now. One day we will be 12. But 12 people is not enough humans to do this work for the whole of government. You know, we like to eat, we like to sleep, I like to see my kids. I like to drink coffee. Actually, if I drink a lot of coffee because there's only 12 people. But we can't serve the needs of the whole system. And so part of our task is to help teams in individual ministries and statutory boards build this capability for themselves. And over time, we have accidentally evolved ourselves an ecosystem, which we are now trying to figure out how to kind of organize a little bit better. So I've talked a lot about the kind of helicopter view of what we do. Let me say a little bit about how we do it. What is the work that the Foresight ecosystem actually does, or the Centre actually does for the Singapore government? The first chunk we call Scout. This is the part that when you say foresight, people typically think of this. This is the what part, right? Identifying what is changing, identifying how it matters. Why does it matter to Singapore? What implications does it have for policy? And then trying to communicate that to the rest of the system, which is easier for me to say than for us to do. It lines up quite neatly with strategy group's first mandate, which is to understand what our level of ambition should be, right? So understanding the environment, the opportunities and challenges it presents to us helps us set our level of ambition. The second is the challenge function. So I said earlier, you can use the future as a safe space to talk about the present. It's where we borrow the future as a place for us to talk about these difficult elephant in the room type conversations, right? You know that these issues are going to be a problem. Actually, you don't need a futurist to tell you this. But what you need is a space where it's safe for you to have these difficult conversations. It's also a space where you can imagine new solutions, right? We've reset your assumptions about the future. You can also reset your solutions. This is the space where it lines up with our job to create alignment across the public service. The last function, a bit unique to the CSF team outside or all the other teams that do this work for individual agencies. It's about growing the capability of the system to both produce foresight, so grow a crop of practitioners, but also to use the foresight. Because we don't do this work for the sake of doing the work, right? We don't do foresight research for the sake of writing fancy papers which our bosses then put in a drawer and never look at again. We do this work so that the system can be better informed and build the resilience and the capabilities it needs. So we also need to build the system's capacity to use the foresight output of all of these teams that are doing such great work across the system. And that is one of our main focuses in the next 24 months. We also try and build a community within the public service. Many of these teams will tell you it's very lonely work. These teams are small, right? They're one-man teams or like 1.5 people. They're usually embedded in some planning function, so half of their lives are doing corporate planning. And it's very lonely being the only guy in your organization whose time horizon is longer than next week. So the community building part helps to make the enterprise sustainable by bringing all of our teams together every 2 months or so for a workshop session. People can share their half-baked ideas, but more importantly, they can see one another. We feed them, we provide beverages of various kinds. It's 5 p.m. on a Friday, so you can guess what kind of beverages. Just so that there is a sense of community and support for these very small, very lonely teams. We've been trying to do that as well at a more senior level, to create space for our decision makers to talk about foresight issues in a context where they don't have to take decisions about them. So they feel a bit more free to have more speculative conversations. So that's our job, Scout, Challenge and Grow. So I said earlier I would talk a bit more about scenario planning. And I thought talking about scenario planning might be also a useful way to illustrate how we do some of this Scout, Challenge and Grow, as well as maybe think about the intersection with design. So what is scenario planning? What are scenarios? We use the word a lot, and actually we've been having a lot of conversations within the team because we're about to embark on a large scenario planning exercise. That very often we say the word and we mean different things. So we've also been trying very hard to articulate when we say scenarios, what do we mean? They aren't just stories about the future, although that's what they are at their heart. They are stories that illustrate possible alternative futures to the one that already lives rent-free in all our heads. Scenarios always come in plurals. We don't have one scenario, we have many, because the function of scenario planning is to challenge that linear projection of the future that lives in our heads. In some cases, the way that we've used scenarios, they are also lenses to highlight particular questions, particular risks, or particular opportunities that we think the organization should be exploring. So they aren't just broad, like I call them the National Geographic style descriptions of future, right? The year is 2040, Singapore looks like XYZ. but they are little narratives that highlight particular challenges, right? Maybe a geostrategic problem, maybe a domestic social cohesion problem, in ways that challenge our decision makers to think differently about these problems. They are not, my favorite picture is on all our slide decks. We do not predict the future. I cannot tell you what 2040 will look like. If people tell you they can, they are either from the future or lying. I leave you to decide which is more likely. Instead, they are really meant to do this, right? To provoke an opening of our minds, our thinking about what might be possible by re-examining our assumptions about the present. We quote Peter Schwartz all the time because he has written a wonderful book, very entertaining book called The Art of the Long View. He's also one of our long-standing friends, a distinguished fellow of the Centre. But it's really, why do we present the future as stories? And not just boring, Nat Geo, David Attenborough, it is the year 2040 type narrations. It's because stories have power, right? Narratives have power to change the way you see facts. They give meaning to the facts that you have collected. And the way that we assemble the facts that we have collected, although there are no facts about the future, the way we've assembled the data that we've collected gives meaning to that data and changes the way people think about the data. I like the idea that scenarios function as myths of the future, because myths, narratives, have power to not just change minds but change actions. And that's what we really want scenarios to be able to do, to convince you at your heart that something is different and therefore you behave differently. The less emotional, this is the slide that we present to decision makers. We don't tell them the narratives have power story, we tell them this one. Why do scenarios help us? To help us plan, because they create a more nuanced and balanced view of the future. It's a polite way of saying that maybe the future that lives rent-free in your head is not a good one. Maybe it's not founded on realities. Maybe it should be founded on different realities. It creates a space for us to explore what-if questions that can often be quite fundamental in terms of meaning-making. Without this kind of space, you often wind up just discussing how questions. How should we do X or Y? Rather than, should we do X or Y? Is this even the right problem for us to be addressing? But scenarios create that space for you to ask more fundamental questions. And finally, the most practical use of scenarios is you can use them to stress test existing strategies. So, do your strategies hold against a wide range of future outcomes? If not, do we want to rethink the strategies now? So, I've been talking about scenarios in the abstract for a while. I thought we'd show you a little bit about how you might construct a set of scenarios to use, right, to generate these conversations. Jim Data and his colleagues kind of looked at a whole bunch of stories from around the world and identified 4 underlying story archetypes, which he then uses to construct 4 different stories of the future. And I think the archetypes, even if you're not in the scenario planning space, the archetypes will be familiar to you. Growth, discipline, collapse, transformation. But effectively, it translates to this, right? The growth is infinite resources, we just keep going. Discipline means something constrains that infinite growth. A rule, a resource constraint, a behavioral tick of the system limits it at a plateau. Collapse means it reaches a maximum and then things fall apart. The center cannot hold, the system breaks down. Transform, always the most challenging scenario. The system becomes something else. If you try these, you'll find the first 3 are very easy to do. And then you get to the transform scenario and you go, I reach for my science fiction novel for inspiration. Because actually, that's how strong a hold the past has on our imaginations. It is extremely difficult without some kind of scaffolding to force yourself to imagine a truly different future. It's why sometimes I refer to, the team will know this, I refer to foresight or scenario planning as organizational therapy, therapy for organizations, right? You're forcing yourself to take a good hard look at what your beliefs are founded on. Can you change those? Sometimes I'm surprised I still have a job. But scenarios alone are not enough. And this, I think, is again where there's maybe some intersection with design. I think a lot of people who are in the futures practice and deeply in the futures practice believe that the work speaks for itself. They're so invested and involved in the research and the thinking that it feels like it should be self-evident. If you just read the report, clearly your minds will be changed, you'll be transformed, and tomorrow you'll wake up a different person. In practice, we know that's not true. Even if the bosses read the reports and we get a good job and a pat on the back, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to engage with the material and they're going to act on the material. Sometimes it's about accessibility. I brought props. So, actually, I'm going to ask Fuad to hand me the props as I talk about them. We do a big scenarios exercise every 5 years or so. And as part of the exercise, we write about all of these emerging trends that we think will shape our operating environment over the next 20 years. It is a 100-page report, very wordy, full of text, full of references, which even I didn't want to read when we were done with it, right? And it was literally my job to proofread and publish this thing. So we asked ourselves, is this the best way to do it? There are two solutions. One, this is not us. This beautiful book is done by our counterparts in the British government. And they do a project they call Global Strategic Trends on the same 5-year cycle as we do. They look out even further than we do. They're very ambitious. This is to 2055. And this is just their description of trends. It is a beautiful book. My arm is tired carrying it. It has what we like to call tumph value. You drop it on the table, it goes tumph. Everyone knows you've done our work. But how much does the average decision maker actually engage with the material? Question mark. And they acknowledge it too, right? Which is why they love our cards as much as we love their book. We decided to go the other way. There is a 90-page report, I promise, 100-page report, I promise. It's on the internet somewhere. But far more popular is this set of cards that we made. And they are tactile. They have bite-sized information, so we've condensed each trend to one card. And they're playable. We've included instructions on how you can play games with these cards to use the material to think about the future. So this, I call them our gateway drug. We give people the cards, we run an activity using the cards, and then we tell them, by the way, there's a 100-page report, you can just click on the link. And what they'll do is they'll go and read the individual pieces of the report that are most salient to them, right? So there's a trend about the global environment, they'll read that. There's a trend about tribal wars, they'll read that. And hopefully it acts as a resource. They know it's there. It has tumph value, it's just not, actually on the desk. But these are some of the ways that we think communicating the material really matters. Not everybody wants to read a 100-page report. Some people do. We've gotten feedback on our 100-page report. Let's just put it that way. We also actually created a video around the material and the cards. But it's a little bit more difficult for us to show that in public. So, if scenarios are not enough in themselves, they need a supporting cast. That's, I think, where some element of design comes in, to think about how we can communicate this material to an audience that might not be as invested in the material as we are. Those are some of the ways, but one of the things that we wanted to show you was a product called Artifacts from the Future. This is taken from our teaching slides, so I'm clicking a little bit more than I normally would. It's about making the future tangible to the audience in a way that sparks thinking, by presenting a future object as reality. What are artifacts? Let's look at some examples, right? What are these things? These are from the past, and they tell us about the past, right? This is a fork, and it's traveling sheath. But when you pick this up as a historian, you look at it, you try and understand, why does this thing exist? What were the life circumstances of the person who owned this item that caused them to need this item, to carry it around, to use it? How was it used? In the same way, if you create an artifact of the future, the user picks it up and goes, why does this apple exist? Right? Why did someone decide that this was a necessary item to have in the future? And through that item, be able to more deeply understand the kind of future environment you might be living in. And now I have to click forward. In interest of time, I will not make you do the audience participation part, but these are some, right? These are some questions that you might ask yourself. If you got hold of a spoon that had a fan attached to it, you'd be like, A, why? But also B, what kind of society creates an item like this, right? What kind of lifestyle requires a fan for your spoon? Because you cannot wait long enough for your soup to cool down to eat it. Or this. What on earth is this? Look, why do we need smart chopsticks to detect contaminants in food? A, very cool. But also B, why are we so afraid of contaminants in our food? Surely something is systematically wrong with food production if I have to test all of it all the time with the thing that I carry around, right? So these artifacts therefore prompt questions, which then unravel the thinking about the environment that the artifacts come from. So that brings me to my last slide, but also to the question I started with. Actually, what is the intersection between futures and design? We were chatting briefly about this before the session started. And one of the intersections, I think, is that the future creates a sense of possibility, that things tomorrow don't have to look like today. And once you open up that space, design has a role to play in helping us imagine actually what those possibilities might be, right, in concrete terms. But I think another one is really that both practices are on the surface about what, right? About what you see, what you do, for us, what the future looks like. But really, the practice is about why. It's about meaning making, right? It's about understanding what you see and trying to reframe what you see to create new possibilities. I think a lot of people don't get the why part of futures. They think it's all about describing prediction, right? They think it's all about forecasting prediction, but really it's about understanding. Why are things the way they are? Why can't they be some other way? And I think that's also a thread that runs through design, right? Why is it that we have to be stuck with a crappy chair? Why do we have to be stuck with a crappy building? Why can't we have something better? And finally, this notion of systems thinking. Objects in their context, data in its context. We have to understand how all the pieces fit together in order to create or uncreate things that exist. Yeah, I think that might be my last slide. I have one last slide. Oh, I do. See, I usually don't have so many clicky things. It's about problem definition and problem solving, but new ways of problem solving, I think is where I want to land. So, with that, I think I've kept the time quite well. We have lots of time for questions. I hope we will have a wonderful discussion. And also, if you want more information about what we do, please scan the QR code. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeanette, for those riveting insights. I now throw the Q&A session to the floor. If you have any burning questions for Jeanette, she can answer it right now.
Let me start with an interesting question. My name is Georgi Popov, University of Central Missouri. And on one of the first slides we had risks and opportunities.